All right, let's go back to cricket. And I want to commence with some general observations, which I had already gone on that trajectory in my previous remarks to you. I want to sort of continue on with that trajectory very, very briefly, and then I want to move to start discussing some of the fundamentals of Lagaan. We will see a few clips today, but we will not conclude our discussion of Lagaan as I mentioned to you before today. We will carry on the discussion on Tuesday as well. And just to reiterate, so we had talked about cricket as an open-ended game and how it's different from, for example, baseball, or the baseball is the closest analogy with respect to, of course, the nature of the game, but how it's different from American sports, and that it's open-ended not simply, as I said to you, because of the fact that a cricket match, unlike, let's say, a baseball game or a basketball game, that need not end in a decisive finish, right? We don't necessarily need to have winners and losers. And of course, we have to extend that metaphor to life, that it's not the case that there have to be winners and losers in everything. All right? And as a way of reminding you of how we can extend some of that discussion onto broader spheres, I was suggesting to you the fact that cricket ends in a draw, and that what I say that often ends in a draw, and that it's an open-ended game, that I think that there is a more healthy respect in some cultures for ambiguity, for gray areas, for ambivalence. And I was suggesting to you that I think that that is actually a fundamental characteristic of American society, that it has very little tolerance for what I'm describing as that gray area, all right? So obviously when we speak about open-ended game, we mean something much more than the fact that cricket very often ends in a draw. And then I had suggested to you that we need to understand some of the origins of this game, and that's the point at which I'd really stopped the discussion, that in England it started out in the late 17th century. By the early 19th century, the rules of cricket are well established. The MCC is sort of the body that oversees the game of cricket and the set of rules that govern this game. But there are also conventions. And for those of you who read the Nandi reading, and I apologize, by the way, it seems that again that link is not, so I'm going to this afternoon at the end of class and before I leave home, I'm going to go and check every link and make sure that the reading is there. But you will see the reading show up. And one of the things that Nandi talks about here is the fact that there are certain kinds of conventions, for example. So there's a convention, for example, where if a player is not ruled out, but the player himself thought that he was out, he begins to walk off the field. Okay, but the umpire has not given him an out. So what should govern? What should the result be? Should he stay on the field because the umpire has not given him out, or should he say that, well, I'm a gentleman because this is a gentleman's game after all? And remember what I mentioned to you about cricket, that cricket is really, when you use the expression, this is not cricket, means that this is not going by the rules of the game. This is not quite right, so forth and so on. So that could be a convention, and sometimes the convention might in fact actually overpower the rule. Right? Now, here's another interesting element. Right? Once you start thinking about the class structure, I pointed out to you in England that today, for example, it is unquestionably the case that cricket is no longer the game of the masses in the same way in which football is. And I was suggesting to you that you would have to compare the passions of cricket in India, not with the passions of cricket in England, but with the passions of football in England. That would be a much closer comparison, and I recall that that is the exact point at which I had terminated my discussion. Moving to India, this game, when it's brought to India by the British, although Nandi, when you start reading him, you'll say that his first line is the most dramatic line of the book, and is extraordinary in its own way, because he said it's basically an Indian game accidentally discovered by the British, right? Now it seems much more Indian than British as a game, and certainly, of course, we know that India is and has been for some decades now a major test-playing country. But if you're looking at its origins in India, it is a game that begins with the princes. Right? So it is an aristocrat, it's a small aristocratic elite that is fundamentally invested in this game. It's played in boarding schools, in boarding colleges, and of course in the playing grounds of the rich and well-to-do. But gradually what you see is the democratization of cricket. It filters down into the middle classes. Now, for those of you who have read the piece, and that one is there by S. Anand, Eating with Our Fingers, it's called, and it's a critique of the film Lagaan. So, you know, there were 3 short pieces on the film Lagaan itself. One of them is by S. Anand, one of them is by another writer, pieces published in Economic and Political Weekly. Both of those 2 pieces are critical of the film, suggesting, and we will address some of these criticisms later on, suggesting that it's kind of a bourgeois nationalist film. And then we have one piece by Makran Paranchpe, which is a robust defense of the film against its critics, right? So those are the 3 pieces we have which are explicitly on this film. Now, Anand in this film, one of the things that he does is he sort of looks at, for example, the composition of the Indian cricket test team over the course of the last several decades, and finds out that the vast majority of players were Brahmins. Okay, so that is to say, upper caste Hindus. You get a few Sikhs as well. You might have a couple of Muslims, but insofar as the players are Hindu, his net conclusion is that the vast majority of them, in fact, are actually upper caste Hindus. You don't really get lower caste Hindus. And of course, this is one of his quibbles about the film, that this film, is kind of shows a unified India because, let's make sure we put in a Muslim, let's make sure we put a disabled person, an untouchable person, etc., etc. But let's not run ahead of the game. You understand that his critique is that, well, frankly, in some respects, Lagaan actually does echo Indian society because it's absolutely silent on the question of caste, he's going to suggest. And in actuality, we find that the test team, at least, has been composed largely of upper caste Hindus. However, it is unquestionably the case, to use a phrase that I've just used, that there has been an extraordinary democratization of cricket in India. This is a game that is played on every street corner. It's played in the village Maidan. Now, somehow this does not resonate with Anand in the same way. He simply doesn't want to register this fact, but it is the game of the masses in India. If there was a game of the masses in India, the state of Bengal, by the way, might be an exception to some degree, just to some small degree, because football, or soccer as it's known here, has an extraordinary following in the state of Bengal. That's a history that I will not go into right now. But nonetheless, if you're looking at India as a whole, there is no question that it has now percolated down to the masses. When I was growing up in the 1960s, 1970s, most of these test players, okay, I'm thinking of players, you don't have to worry about the names, of course, but just, they may resonate for one or two of you, and players like Sunil Gavaskar, Vishwanath, okay, and then you had a famous trio of actually quartet of spin bowlers, Prasanna, Bedi, Chandrasekhar, all right? Most of these people were all people who were employed full-time in some white-collar job. Most Indian cricket players used to work in banks. They had full-time jobs as bank managers or mid-level officers. You could not make a living from cricket in the 1970s in India. The thought that you would make a living from a game, from a sport, was unthinkable. Right? So cricket was something that they played by the side, And in fact, it's a great credit to them that these people who were actually employed, as I said, full-time in other occupations, many of them, nonetheless were able to put themselves in some shape to become a part of a test team, and India was competing at the test level in the 1960s and 1970s. All right? And what's the point of that anecdote? That you're seeing here now cricket percolating down to the middle classes. Down to the middle classes, because you could be upper caste. And here, this is again a real failing, because you always have to think about, well, someone's written this piece, but how do I critique this piece? In India, you can be upper caste, but still be middle class, or even lower class for that matter. Because when you're a Brahmin, you have status, you have ascription, right? People recognize that you're a member of a higher caste, but you might actually be not well off in society at all. You might be relatively poor. Right? And so these were people who came from the middle class. There's no question about that. You don't have princes and aristocratic elites who are member of the Indian cricket team in the 1970s now, unlike the 1920s and 1930s. And what we're seeing at that point is we're seeing really the kind of democratization, as I'm pointing out, of cricket, where now, over the course of the last few decades, there is but no question that cricket is India's game, right? That it is, as I said, a game that is played on every street corner and in every village maidan or ground, all right? So this slide is meant to capture some of these kinds of considerations and some of this history. And as I had suggested to you, that when we start thinking about cricket, cricket is an apt place to start thinking about the whole question of nationalism, which I think Lagaan, more than any other film, makes amply clear. Because what we have here is that the passions that are aroused by the idea of the nation state are in many ways the passions that are aroused by cricket and vice versa. And cricket, of course, here now becomes the playing field for thinking about the very idea of the nation state and nationalism. Thinking about the nation state means to think also about who is included in it and who is not. So think about how the team in Lagaan is put together. Think about all the objections when, for example, Bhuvan decides that he's going to induct Kachra into the team. Those of you who are not South Asian probably don't know what the word, I mean, even the word Kachra means garbage, trash. It literally means trash, okay? So when you are thinking about the nation state and the project of the nation state, what we're also thinking about is who is included and who is not. Every nation state has boundaries. And the United States is, again, a very good illustration. And here I'm not talking about the wall that Mr. Trump would like to put up between the US and Mexico. I'm talking about the boundaries within America already, about who is considered to be a proper subject of a nation state and not. And this is a difficult matter to assess because you cannot simply take a legal view of the matter. For example, if you ask me, are African Americans part of the nation state? Okay, and I would say, well, only legally are they part of the nation state because most African Americans don't have the rights, frankly, that white people in this country have, right? If the whole question of white privilege means precisely to think that, well, we have some kind of ownership over this country, you know. So therefore, this question of inclusion and exclusion is a question that is intrinsic to the question of the nation state. It is not simply a matter of India or what is transpiring in this film that we are speaking about. We are speaking about the fact that a nation state project is always a bloody project. That is, that you have to coalesce people, coerce them into becoming subjects, and then there are some who are excluded. And one of the ways, by the way, this film is not really about the question of legislation, but you know that most countries attempt to become more inclusive through legislation. What is it that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did? And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the act that no one remembers, by the way, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, right? This was a trio of acts that were absolutely critical in the 1960s for giving African Americans some semblance of some place in this society at this juncture in time. But of course, legislation cannot make a person love someone else. It can tell white society that these are the consequences of racism, and you are forbidden from, if you're a white employer, you're forbidden from discriminating against African American people. But the law cannot tell a white person, you have to love a black person. Right? Affection cannot be manufactured by law. So what we learn from legislation when we are thinking about how a society evolves is that legislation can have limitations, and sometimes it can obscure the need for social change. Because often when legislation has been passed, people come to the decision that, well, the problem is resolved. You know? In South Africa, the problem of apartheid was not resolved merely because, right, you had the apartheid government fall. No. So this is what I think the other context that you must bear in mind when you're thinking about the whole question of inclusiveness and exclusiveness, because Lagaan is very much a film in this sense about the whole question of inclusiveness and exclusiveness, both in a society and in a nation state. And then, of course, I've suggested to you that cricket here should be viewed as a national allegory. This is an allegory about the whole question of how do we think of the project of the nation state, the project of nation building, what are the responsibilities that people have, and so on. And just as cricket has its divisions and its allegiances, as every sport does, that is very much the case, obviously, with the whole problem of the nation state as well. Now, there is one last consideration in this larger set of considerations before we move to the fundamentals of Lagaan itself, and that is India's, quote, success in cricket. That one reason why, of course, cricket arouses those kind of passions, to take a rather cynical view of the matter and a harsh view of the matter, is because this is one of the few areas where India is successful. Right? People become more passionate. I mean, if the Indian cricket team continue to lose match after match, I think some of the passion for cricket would probably dissipate, I would suspect. Right? But this is one of the few arenas in which India is successful. Now, long before you read Anand for this week, you might recall that I think 2-3 weeks ago I had pointed out to you, I think in a different context, that that if you look at India, I mean, now it's a country of 1.25 billion plus, and I think I'd mentioned to you, I can't remember exactly in what context, that when you look, for example, at the Indian Olympics, and you look at India's results in the Olympics, I mean, it's a dismal story. Right? I mean, it's a pathetic story, pathetic. I mean, if I could think of a word more pathetic than pathetic, I'd think of that, because it's worse than pathetic. I mean, there have been years, and the Olympics is only played every 4 years. Imagine if it were done every year, we would be going through national mourning every year, right? Now, luckily now we only have to do this once every 4 years, because the whole Indian team comes back after the Olympics, and they don't even have a single bronze medal. And then, of course, the Indian elites will, and the commentators will say, oh, look at measly Uzbekistan. Who ever heard of Uzbekistan? And they won 5 gold medals. And Kazakhstan won 3 gold medals. You know, and Ethiopia won 8. And, isn't there a single man in this country of 1.25 billion? Right? And then there's this, sort of Tarzan-like, thumping of the chest, or Shiite self-flagellation. There must be something wrong with us. We are people who essentially don't have qualities of manliness and dignity, so forth and so on. Right? And there's a huge outpouring. Now, Anand's sort of critical perspective is that, look, one of the reasons why Lagaan became quite popular, although he says that it was popular only in the metros, so he's trying to undermine even its success, so to speak, in that sense, that it was never really popular in the villages. I'm not convinced of that part of the argument in any case, but his view is that, look, one of the reasons why Lagaan was popular is because there's so little to celebrate in India. Now here you have this, this team, ragtag team, frankly. I mean, a bunch of people picked off the street, as it were, right? And the film shows that, well, they're able to beat the mighty British Empire. And this is a reason for saying that, okay, we can do something. And so the view here is that Lagaan, in this sense, is a film that was really made to satisfy a set of Indian middle-class bourgeois elites who have very little to be thankful about. Right? This is the cynical kind of reading of Lagaan. And I don't think, incidentally, that you should dismiss that reading altogether. I'm not persuaded, really, that this is the best way to read this film, but I think that with a film like this, whenever you have, I think in general when you view films, and when it leaves you with this feeling, that was really nice, then I think you should check yourself and say, there's probably something wrong there. We have to be a little bit, cynical or skeptical at least about what's transpiring here. All right, so those are the broader considerations. Now we get to this question of what I am calling the fundamentals of Lagaan. Let me just see if I can. Okay, so Lagaan, some considerations. All right. Let's begin first with this. Here we have a game. But the metaphor of game, by the way, and remember now we have to think about not the year that Lagaan was made. We have to think about the year in which the film is set. Okay? And we're talking about the late 19th century, the very early part of the 20th century. That's the time period that we're really thinking about. There was what was called the Great Game. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Great Game. Okay? And Kipling, the great writer Kipling, the author of the novel Kim. Kipling, by the way, grew up in India. That's another interesting story. Major British writer. And his brother was, in fact, a major painter, also worked with stained glass in India. Now, Kipling used the idea of what he called the Great Game. And the Great Game was to refer to the fact that this whole area of India, particularly the northwestern part of it, bordering on Pakistan and then moving into Afghanistan, this was all part of the world. It was a part of the world where the British and and Russia were jockeying for power. And of course, this is what you're seeing even today. Why is it that the United States is so heavily invested in Afghanistan? I mean, most American officials have said that there isn't a single building worth its name in Afghanistan from their point of view. Well, if there isn't a single building, and you think that all their women are completely oppressed, and you think that all the men are basically either terrorists or heroin addicts, right? Then why the hell have you invested $2 or $3 trillion in Afghanistan? And why have thousands of American soldiers lost their lives? Because it is part of the Great Game. That this is part of the world where the jockeying for power has geopolitical implications. Right? And I think that when you're thinking of a game, and at that juncture, you cannot but think of the Great Game. All right? Secondly, let us not forget, in case we get carried away by the game, right? And I think one does get carried away. This is a film where the last 1 hour, 20 minutes is the game, actually. First you see the British players on the field, then you see the Indian players on the field, and it's almost like watching a 20 overs limited match. Now they have a different version. They have different versions of cricket, so there's the 50 overs, and then they have what's called the T20, 20 overs on each side. It's almost like watching a 20 overs game at home. being played between, let's say, India and England, all right? So we can get carried away. But before we get carried away, Lagaan reminds us of the fact that colonialism is, in the first instance, a system of economic exploitation. It is a film about the Lagaan, about the tax that the British sought to impose. And of course, this whole story where Captain Russell, on a whim, decides that, all right, I'm going to cancel this if you bunch of ignorant villagers, who have mocked our game. Because what is it that irks him? What irks him is the fact that Bhuvan had described this game as a kind of a Gulli-danda. So, I wish I could show you. I'd love to show you, because I used to play Gulli-danda when I was young. So, you have this little, I don't know what you would call it, a little kind of piece of wood pointed at both ends, and you put it on the floor, and you take a piece of stick, and then you hit one end of it, and this little thing will fly up in the air, and then you whack it if you can. Okay? And you see where it goes. And this is the beginning of Gulli-danda. So he just thinks this is really, frankly, cricket. I mean, all these monkeys, as he calls them, dressed in their white suits and everything. And notice, by the way, the little protocols, right? Which suggests to you, by the way, it's a gentleman's game. The breaks for tea, the polite clapping by the ladies. He takes off his sweater. Did you notice that? There's a scene where one of the players takes off his sweater, the English players, and then he hands it to the umpire, and then the umpire folds it. I mean, this looks like one of these sales agents at Basie's department store, right? Folds the sweater and then holds the sweater like that. These are the protocols of the game, right? But what's critical here? What's critical, after all is said and done, is economic exploitation, the extraction of revenue. This was the central economic drive. And so in that sense, I think the anti-colonial sentiments of Lagaan begin with that very fact. It begins with the fact of recognition that we are speaking about a system of economic exploitation. Then Lagaan brings to the fore, number 3, the whole question of colonialism and culture. And as an illustration, I want to take the question of vegetarianism. Right? Now here again you see overlaps with, for example, Mr. and Mrs. Iyer. The vegetarianism, I spoke about this question at some length because I was suggesting to you that vegetarianism is not simply a matter of lifestyle choice, right? Which is what it is principally, and which is how it really originated in the West. In the West, this idea, and I think for most people in the West today who are vegetarians in some sense of the term, it's a matter of lifestyle choice. Right? Now here we are not speaking simply about a matter of lifestyle choice, we are speaking about religion. That there is a profound relationship between vegetarianism and the kind of religiosity that a person might in fact actually espouse. And there is a remarkable scene in this film, so I want to see if we can now point to this particular scene. Let me see if I can quickly find it. So I think you would remember the scene that I'm talking about. The scene I'm talking about is where, okay, over here, there we go, we hit it exactly on the spot. Are we getting any, we're not getting any volume, so let me see if I can, 1 second. What happened to the volume here? Okay. Okay, 1 minute. I might have to disconnect this to get the. Yeah. Okay.
It's a big goose cut. You eat it and consider your job done.
Okay, so you remember the context for this, right? That the
तो कैप्टन रसल क्या सोच रहे हैं? क्या ये मुमकिन है?
well, just watch the scene.
He could be persuaded.
He has come to see him. The local Raja has come to see Captain Russell, and he's come to see him because he's trying to request that the tax be waived because there's been a drought, right? And the conditions are extremely difficult for the villagers, right? That's the context. So he comes there, and then and now you'll see the conversation.
But on one condition. एक शर्त है.
एक शर्त है.
हाँ, कहिए. Eat the meat, Your Highness.
You can see the reaction of Elisabeth, right?
आप ये गोश्त खाए और मैं डलिया सिंह से बात करूँगा. As I told you, I'm a vegetarian. हम शाकाहारी हैं. सिर्फ एक गोश्त का टुकड़ा. You eat it and consider your job done. Eat the meat. हमारे गोश्त खाने से मंदिर का क्या ताल्लुक? कोई ताल्लुक नहीं है. सिर्फ मैं आपको गोश्त खाते हुए देखना चाहता हूँ. कैप्टन रसल, कर्म का धागा पहनने के लिए हम धर्म का धागा नहीं तोड़ते. I'm sorry. Well, ठीक है. तो फिर आप मुझे डबल टैक्स दीजिए. तो ना लगा. देखिए रसल जी, पिछले साल आधा लगान भी मैंने आपकी.
Okay, that's enough. All right, what do you think? I mean, this was one of the most chilling scenes for me in the film. And I'll give you two episodes from Indian history which will then make you understand the implications of what's happening here. In 1857, 1858, you had what's called the Sepoy Mutiny, or otherwise known as the Great Rebellion. The rebellion of 1857-58 was the most catastrophic for the British, initially, of all the revolts that had broken out. The one that posed the greatest challenge to their rule. Now, when the British finally crushed the rebellion of 1857, in early 1858, they stormed into the Red Fort in Delhi. The Red Fort was where the Mughal emperor used to sit. And technically, even though the British had been ruling India for some period of time, you still had officially a Mughal emperor, also known as the King of Delhi. And he used to sit in the Red Fort. That was where his palace was, within the precincts of the fort. And the official British chronicler of the rebellion himself tells us that the first thing that the British soldiers did when they crushed the rebellion and entered the fort, and of course then took the king captive, is they drank wine and they ate pork. And if you were an innocent reader of that text, you would say to yourself, well, they ate pork, so what? No, that's everything. That would be like going to a Jewish synagogue, okay? A Jewish synagogue, and eating pork inside the synagogue. Now, would you say, so what? No, you wouldn't. Because, of course, you would understand the implications that the consumption of pork is taboo for a Jew as it is for a Muslim. And if you want to humiliate the other, you want to show them that you have now re-territorialized this fort. Right? This is to reoccupy, re-territorialize, and to colonize your mind. go and you do exactly the two things that a devout Muslim, which is what the Mughal emperors were Muslims, the two things that a Muslim is not supposed to do is to drink alcohol and to eat pork. That's exactly what you do. When they would capture, when the British, we have it on record that when the British used to capture Indian rebels, if they captured a rebel who was a Hindu, they would stuff beef down his throat deliberately. Because their view was, the Hindu is going to feel so defiled that he is now going to suffer social death. That is that for all practical purposes, he's dead now. Right? And when they captured a Muslim rebel, what would they do? They would stuff pork down his throat. Right? This is what we're talking about. Now, because of course you have to ask yourself, well, Captain Russell is just, frankly, he's just an arbitrary idiot, right? You think to yourself, or, he says, well, okay, if you want to make sure that I accept your request, all you have to do is just eat one piece of meat. And you might think to yourself, well, why is he being so arbitrary? No, he's not being arbitrary. He knows exactly what he is doing. He knows exactly what he's doing because he's saying to the Maharaja, you defile yourself and I'll do. In other words, I want you to grovel at my feet, effectively. That's what he's really telling him. And of course, the film raises this scene raises interesting ethical questions, because you might say to yourself, well, maybe for the sake of the larger community, he should have said, I'll grovel, I'll eat the meat, because if that's going to save my entire village or my entire province from this double Lagaan, because immediately you saw that scene, the next thing when he says, no, I'm not going to do it, then Captain Russell says, I'm going to double the Lagaan. Then you have to pay me double Lagaan now. You have to pay me double tax. And that can be an interesting ethical problem or issue, whereby you could say that, well, maybe in the name of a larger religion of humanity, the Maharaja should have agreed. But we can understand what he is doing. Right? This is what I'm trying to point your attention to. Right? And so this is when I say that Lagaan should also be viewed as a consideration about culture. What do we mean by culture? What is the nature of culture? What is the notion of Indian culture at work here? And where does vegetarianism is only one instance of that. There are many other instances of it. All right? Okay, fourth consideration, a critical consideration. In fact, it may be one of the most important things about the film. It is transparent that the British, however much a person who is animated by nationalism and who is animated by anti-colonialism, however much they might be inclined to think that, look, the British are a homogeneous lot, okay? The film tries to suggest that the British were never entirely homogeneous either. And nowhere is this better done than by simply creating a split between the brother and the sister, which incidentally is not the same thing as creating a split between two white men. Because hypothetically, that's also a possibility, that you could have had someone in Captain Russell's entourage or one of the junior officials say, hey, Andrew, or sir, I think that you're behaving like a barbarian, or I disagree with what you're doing. No, there's no voice of dissent there. There's no voice of dissent among those who are working under him. Maybe they're not as brutal as him at times, but there's no voice of dissent there, right? There is a voice of dissent, and that's his own sister. So here we have two separate questions, and one question has to do with why this voice of dissent is cast as female agency. Okay? So in other words, what that does is it immediately puts into play the whole idea of masculinity and the critique of masculinity, that in some respects you can see Lagaan as a film that is a critique of masculinity, because this is unquestionably the case that the colonial state had a certain relationship with the whole question of masculinity. The colonial state embodied a kind of masculinity, and colonization is always, in some respects, a project of masculinization. Right? So there is that set of considerations here. We are looking at, but I want to make another point here, and so to that extent, of course, Elisabeth, as I said, who is the voice of female agency here, she is someone who's putting into question that, right? But I want to make a larger point, and this is why we have to go back to this question of the colonial West and the other West. Now, I want you to think about Hind Swaraj here for a moment. Because fundamentally, when we look at someone like Gandhi, and we're going to eventually turn to him in the second half of the course as well, when we turn to someone like Gandhi, what is most striking about Gandhi, with respect to the question we're looking at right now, is that Gandhi came to the view that the project of freedom is indivisible. What is meant by that is that it's not possible for some people to be free if others are not free. And you might say that, well, that sounds wonderful, but isn't it the case that there are people who are free and there are others who are not? But then, of course, we'll have to ask, well, what do we mean by free? Because you could be free in some sense of the term, but that you're fundamentally colonized, you're fundamentally enslaved to other things. And if we accept the proposition that all of humanity is one, in some sense of the term, and one doesn't have to really be very spiritual necessarily to accept that, one can simply accept it from a humanist standpoint. One can accept it from a humanist standpoint, and in fact, I think the world, at least in principle, has been moving that, which is what all of these universal declarations of human rights and things like that are about. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not simply an affirmation of the fact that everyone, has certain rights. It's an affirmation of the fact that there is a fundamental kind of humanity that is common. And yes, it takes different colors and different hues, and some people are short and some are fat, some are brown and some are white, some are female, some are male, so forth and so on. Right? But that there is something there that which makes it possible to speak of the humanity of every individual. All right? Now, the Gandhian project, therefore, is a project. Let's try to understand the implications and then see what the implications are for interpreting Lagaan, and trying to understand why it is the figure of Elisabeth, the sister of Andrew, Captain Russell, who becomes the figure of the other West. So the implications, if we take Gandhi a little bit further, are that it was not simply India that needed to be liberated from British rule. The British had to be liberated from their own worst tendencies. Captain Russell is very much, and so are the men who are playing with him. All of these men are men who need to be liberated. They are no better off than the Indians in some fundamental respects. So therefore, the project of anti-colonialism is not simply freeing India from colonial rule, it's making the British more humane. Now, when you make them more humane, right, then we can speak about a more inclusive project of freedom. She represents, in other words, now, look at it this way, that we cannot simply set up an opposition between us and them. We cannot. And if I may transpose this to a scene that you're slightly more familiar with, let's take the American Civil Rights Movement for a second once again. Right? I mean, one of the fundamental impulses behind Martin Luther King was precisely this. That yes, we recognize the severe injustice that has been perpetrated against us by dominant white society. But this doesn't mean that there are not white people, that there are no white people with whom we can work. That there are white people who are sympathetic to the cause, whether you want to call them white liberals or white radicals, so forth and so on. But we need to seek an alliance with them. They represent the other America. So Gandhi's view was that there is another West, that the West itself is splintered, that before the West colonized India, before the English colonized India, they colonized themselves. They colonized themselves into believing that masculinity was the most prized thing in the world, for example. And of course they colonized. English white males colonized the Irish, they colonized the Scots, the Welsh, they colonized the working class, they colonized all their women, they colonized all their immigrants, no question about that. So you see the implications. And what Lagaan is really doing here now, it is in some ways enacting that idea that Miss Russell, Elisabeth, she represents that other West. She shows the possibility of working with the West. And of course in Lagaan that becomes literally the case, because she goes over to the other side. And Captain Russell finds out and is enraged, and then does what men like to do in these situations. Well, I'm going to lock you up, You dare not leave the house, dare not leave, the palace, right? And then she has to slip away. So there are a lot of metaphors there too that we can think about, but we'll leave those aside for the moment. Right? But the implications are very clear. That this is an argument about the other West. And the other West has to be cast in the voice of a female, be given female agency, because this film is at the same time a critique of masculinity, as embodied in the figure of Captain Russell. All right? So I think that these are, and we haven't yet gotten to the question of the composition of the team and what that means, and of course then the whole critique, well, is that the way one builds up a nation, so forth and so on. Yes, you had a question?
So I understand that there were two sides. Miss Russell was sort of like the more humane of the West, and like the brother wasn't. But I'm sort of struggling to understand, like when you said like the British needed to be liberated as well.
Yes.
For Gandhi, like did India like liberate the British? Because I understand that India sort of like through revolts and like sort of snatched their freedom back.
Look at it this way. The problem of black people in this country, it's not their problem. It's basically a problem of white people. Unless you reform dominant white society, you're not going to be able to make much progress with the whole question of the rights of African Americans. White society needs to be liberated from its worst tendencies, including the whole impulse towards white supremacism, for example, which of course has reared its ugly head all over in this country. I mean, it was always there. It's always there. Never for a moment in my 40 years in the US have I believed that it was never there. It's always there. But sometimes it just surfaces much more viciously, and you're seeing that exactly now. Right? If you said to me that we can resolve the problems, the racial problems, the social problems, the class problems of this society by enacting 10 more civil rights acts, no. We're not going to be able to do that unless fundamentally white people are themselves reformed. That they are brought to the realization that we're actually not free because we are handicapped by all our racisms and prejudices and so forth and so on. That's what I'm saying. That fundamentally, you see, you cannot colonize others unless you colonize yourself first. This was the great Gandhian insight. It works both at the micro level, at the level of an individual, and it works at the level of a nation. Captain Russell is a profoundly colonized man. It is not the villagers of India who alone are colonized. They are colonized in a sense because they are subjected to various forms of oppression. And they may oppress each other as well. Let's be clear about that. You don't have to have a hunky-dory impression of India, that all our problems were problems on account of the colonial master from overseas. Right? There are differences within Indian society. And of course, part of Anand's critique is that these differences are glossed over. They're minimized. Because after all, at the end of the day, they all come together. They all come together and they play as a team, so forth and so on. And yes, of course, that's grounds for criticism, but that's a separate issue. Right? What we're saying is that we know the nature of the system of economic exploitation here, right? And we can see, and of course you could say that Captain Russell is sort of a person who is shown in an extreme fashion. He's not a caricature, though, by the way. I would not, he's not a caricature in the way in which a lot of characters in Purab or Paschim are somewhat like caricatures. He's not a caricature, He is someone who, in a sense, I'm suggesting to you, is himself being brutalized. This brutalization has to do with the manner in which England had to homogenize itself over a period of time. And of course, we cannot go over the whole history of English colonization of Scotland, but you should read what the English did to the Scots, what the English did to the Irish. In some respects, by the way, they treated them sometimes, and in some respects and on some occasions, they treated them worse as the Indians. Because, this is apostasy within. When you see your own white man, whom you absolutely detest, there's a different kind of hatred for the Irish. And that had to do with a great many things. It had to do with their Catholicism, for example. It had to do with their Catholicism, their superstitions. It had to do, the English had this view about the Irish diet. I don't know if you ever heard the quip about a 7-course Irish meal. I spent a whole month in Ireland some years ago and picked it up. There, a 7-course Irish meal, if you don't know, is a 6-pack and a potato. That's a 7-course Irish meal, all right? And the English would always talk about the 7-course Irish meal, as though their food was any better. I call that 6 potatoes and a beer. That's their 7-course Irish meal, all right? But you see what I'm trying to suggest. This is what I mean. I'm not saying that the colonization of India and the self-colonization by the English of themselves, and then their colonization of the Scots and the Irish, to take these three, that they're all the same. They're not the same, but they're homologous. That is, that they exist on the same plane. And they help us understand each other forms of colonization. That's fundamentally the argument that I'm trying to put before you at this juncture. All right? Now, does Elisabeth represent, so if you look at that slide over there, does Elisabeth represent a critique of colonialism, or does she represent colonialism by seduction? So now I'm suggesting a slightly different reading. That she represents the other West, but you could take the view that, look, she's not fundamentally anti-colonial. And there is some truth to that argument, that we can overread her figure. Because it's not as though she is saying that I'm going to side with the villagers because fundamentally I too believe in this anti-colonial resistance movement. No. Her constant refrain is what? Fairness. Fairness. She says to her brother on several different occasions, beginning with that conversation at that table where there was a conversation between the Maharaja, the local Hindu ruler, and Captain Russell. And she says, this is not fair, Andrew, what you're saying. Why are you asking him to eat meat? What does this have to do? Don't you realize that this is what she's suggesting? The very look she gives. It's like, this is not fair. This is not British. It's not British. It's not cricket. You see? And she will constantly, I want you to, if you go back and watch the film, you will see she constantly raises the question of fairness. Right? But so therefore, now the implication of that is that Captain Russell represents one kind of colonialism, which is colonialism by force. By force. Okay, so if I had to now transpose it to a different level of comparison, let's call it German. Prussianism, the big boots type. Whereas Elisabeth represents colonialism by seduction. The American model. We'll send you our Michael Jordans and McDonald's and Madonnas. We'll colonize through cultural capital and through our ideal of freedom. Let the bells ring, blah, 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 1776, founding fathers, never mind the fact that they're all slave owners, all of that. No, because that doesn't matter, This is the grand narrative, right? I mean, we are the beacon of light for the whole world. When we cry, the whole world should cry. When we weep, the whole world should weep. That's seduction. A little love-making by the side. We'll give you some aid. We'll bomb you, but then we'll give you aid. Every country the US has bombed, then they'll give them aid, $500 million, $2 million, but we'll bomb you first, So they
have some kind of spend down.
Of course, it's useful for the economy. There is no American economy without the military. I hope you all know that. Right? She represents seduction. And literally here seduction, because Bhuvan is seduced. In some sense, the others are seduced in some sense. The white mame with her parasol, and starched white dresses and the lace and all of that. One can do a lot of routine around that. Right? That's seduction. But she's not anti-colonial, you could argue. That's a different reading now. We could say that this is what Elisabeth represents. And then finally we have the trope of collaboration. Colonialism was never possible without some Indians becoming collaborators, partaking of the project of colonialism themselves, and that's where you always get the traitor. This is an old trope that the British conquest of India began with what is called the battle. It was really not a battle. It's called a battle. It's been glorified as a battle. It was a skirmish. The Battle of Plassey, 1757. But what happened at 1757? Half the Indian army didn't show up because they had been bribed, or they were having their chai, probably, right? That the local Raja had been bribed, and he told his soldiers, don't even show up on the battlefield. So some historians have written, Jawaharlal Nehru himself mentioned that in the discovery of India, that this is the whole story, the whole sordid story began with some element of collaboration. And here you have the collaboration. The team would have lost because you have one man who goes over to the other side. He becomes an informant. He goes surreptitiously, you know who I'm speaking about, right? He goes surreptitiously, he tells Captain Russell that your sister is tutoring these men, and then Captain Russell, of course, being the wise one, says, "Tum bhi shamil ho jao game mein." You also get yourself admitted into the team, because if you really are going to work for us, you might as well play, but make sure that you don't catch the balls and all of that. And that's exactly what happens when the Indian team starts fielding, when the British start batting. If you've seen the film, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That is a trope of collaboration. So this is not done innocently. This is done with the full awareness of what we are talking about here. Okay? Now we get to the fundamentals of Lagaan. Okay? And when I say the fundamentals here, please excuse the spelling, I'll correct it later on. The absent father. So I think somebody here at the outset had mentioned that, and I said there is a little, so this is the reference to the absent father, because, of course, you know who I'm referring to, right? Where is Bhuvan's father in all of this? He doesn't seem to have a father. There's always a mother there, but there's never a father. And then, of course, you have to begin to ask yourself, what is that metaphor really all about? Is it the fact that we don't have nuclear families in India? Well, that doesn't seem very likely. And is this a metaphor? Much more likely, reading, a metaphor for the loss of masculinity. Right? Was the colonization of India made possible by this loss of masculinity? Right? That's a possible reading. Yes, Prashant.
Would it also mean that it's just to show like how strong that the mom is, that the mom doesn't need the man to take care for the kids, so it's to be more respectful towards the mothers?
Yeah, look, I mean, no, but I mean, you know, typically, you know, I don't, you could say that, look, this is a cinematic contrivance in all of these films that we've seen in Diwar, and Mother India, and Lagaan. You could say it's a cinematic contrivance to give more respect to the woman, or this makes it possible to have empowered women. After all, if the father is not around and somebody is raising these children, we don't know anything about who's raised Bhuvan. It's probably the whole village that has raised Bhuvan, you know. Anya?
I also feel like, well, in all of the absent father movies we watch,
Yeah.
it's always the son who doesn't have a father.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of indicates her masculine energy in that
Yeah,
son, like,
yeah.
and how he has to cope with that and also retain that for himself and figure out how he can be
Yeah.
a strong masculine figure.
That's right, but that's what I was referring to as the loss of masculinity and all of that, the loss of paternal authority. But you see, but we can always have multiple readings here. We can see it as a loss of masculinity, a questioning of paternal authority. But we can also see it as a cinematic contrivance in a way, which is sort of like what Prashant's question is about in a way, as a cinematic contrivance for female empowerment, although doesn't seem to be very much the case, for example, in Lagaan, because Bhuvan's mother, she has a role there, but it's not a critical role, all things considered, in this film. But one notices it, right? It's noticeably there. The father is a stand-in for the nation state himself, actually, in some ways. So that you could say that you could extend it to say that, well, at this point, you don't really have the project of a nation state, and that's what the loss of the father or the absent father really represents in some sense. All right? Did you have a question? Yeah.
In the movie, there is sort of a father figure, and that's the voice of Amitabh Bachchan.
Yeah. Well, but I don't know if that's I don't know if I would call that a father figure. No. I mean, he's the voiceover, is the narrator. In this particular film, and yes, it is the voice of Amitabh Bachchan, so they pick an iconic figure to do that. But Amitabh Bachchan has been picked for this voiceover because of his rich voice in a lot of films.
And very, very recognizable.
Yeah. So I think that there are other reasons for having picked him for that. Now, then you have, by the way, the improbable wager. Because of course, I think if you see this film and you think to yourself, well, this is a crazy bet. I mean, they can't possibly win this bet. Bhuvan might think in his moments of bravado and his swagger that, oh, this is just a form of Gulli-danda. But of course, we know that cricket requires different skills, which is not to undermine, by the way, the game of Gulli-danda. All right, I just want to quickly add that as a little note. But nonetheless, I think the interesting question that is raised is, isn't this some kind of improbable wager? There is an improbable wager in the Mahabharata, if I may put it this way. So I think I had mentioned this to you in the first class when I was introducing it, how some mythic elements enter into it. There is also a film which I have made available to you. It's not required viewing, and you don't have to write an entry on that. It's an extraordinary film, Naya Daur. Naya Daur means new age, okay? And it's one of these films that was made in the 1950s. It's got Dilip Kumar. And this, Lagaan, I have not written an article on this yet, but I would argue that Lagaan is in some ways not a remaking of Naya Dor, but in some ways it picks up from Naya Dor. So in Naya Dor, the scenario that you have is you have, the film is set in a village, and then this man who has come back from the West and is modernized, and he wants to introduce, all of this machinery and everything, and there's resistance to that. So then there's going to be this bet, and the bet has to do with who can get from distance A to distance B. Can you get there faster, using a motorized vehicle or not, right? That's basically what it's going to be, and it looks like we know what the answer is going to be, but that's again the improbable bet or the improbable wager. Right? So, but that, I think, as I said, there are kind of deeper mythic elements there. Then we think about the temple on the hill. You have the temple on the hill, by the way, in Naya Dor, and the temple on the hill occupies an iconic place in Lagaan as well. All right. I just want to take 1 minute with that. We're not going to get to the rest of the slide today because we're over time. But the temple on the hill that I'm speaking about here, there are interesting questions and problems about it. Because in some respects, we know that the temple is a site of worship for Hindus. Right? But in some respects, it seems to be the temple of everyone. So a lot of the crucial scenes, when they're not on the cricket field, are at the temple. And particularly you have this scene where one of the characters is going to run up the temple, and you know that, by the way, that that after the British have played their innings, and then the Indians are going to play their innings, and there's a scene where they go to the temple because it looks like everything is lost. They've lost 4 of their key batsmen, the Indians, and they've only scored 99 runs. Ismail is injured. There's no speculation at that point that he's going to come back and play the next day. That's, by the way, one of the conventions of cricket. All right, that convention is that, when you have an injured player, he can come back and he can get a runner. He can get a runner. The Indians didn't know that. It's the fairness of the British which makes it possible, Right? So we'll talk about this element of fairness later on, but the temple on the hill, this is where some of those scenes takes place. And so if you were a critic of Lagaan, you would say to yourself, the temple becomes the site, religious site, for everyone in the village, for the Muslims in the village too. Right? So is this a way in which Hinduism, much like the proverbial sponge, whenever there's a spill of any kind, Hinduism will swallow it up. Right? And is this a way in which members of other religious faiths are co-opted? That's the kind of critique that somebody like Anand would most likely make when you look at the whole figure of the temple on the hill. All right, we're going to stop there, and let me quickly